Hi, I'm Kendall Salcido, the Executive Director of Nomagea, and I've been developing and implementing methodologies for human rights due diligence since about 2008, both in my capacity as a researcher for Nomagea and independently as a consultant for corporations and financial institutions. I've evaluated the human rights impacts of large, mid-sized, and small businesses in a wide array of industries across 6 continents, and I've learned that the realities on the ground do not always align with the reporting in CSR documents. Companies will present investors with reports and ERM processes as human rights due diligence, and it's really hard to know whether they actually identify and address human rights risks. The Venn diagram of due diligence isn't balanced. Financial due diligence is a process of verifying that 2 sets of numbers align. Fiduciary due diligence, which safeguards investors from financial loss caused by corporate shortcomings, again, is focused on profitability. Human rights due diligence actually has nothing to do with profitability, though, making it difficult to integrate into traditional enterprise risk management systems. Human rights risks can't be weighed through the cost-benefit analysis of ERM because there is no cost savings that could justify, for example, the enslavement of workers or the murder of protesters. Human rights are a floor below which operations commit not to go. A decision that would violate human rights is impermissible, even if preventing the harm is costly. And what's more, human rights due diligence involves both the process of identifying human rights risks and remediating or reversing them. Companies that identify harms without mitigating them are failing in their due diligence, as articulated through the UNGPs. So, what red flags can you look for in a company's presentation on human rights due diligence, and what questions can you ask to potentially lower those flags? There are 6 red flags to look for that we'll go over one by one today. Companies often refer to salience to differentiate issues that pose a human rights risk to people as opposed to materiality, which signals a financial risk to the operation. But how companies identify salient issues is really important. Salient issues should reflect findings from operational footprints. They should be tied to specific impacts identified through field-based investigations. Investors can recognize when companies have treated salience as a board exercise rather than a result of investigation by asking about specific operational footprints. Telecom giant Orange, for example, scoped its due diligence plan to make no mention of high-risk contexts or the salience of issues pertinent to specific footprints. It scoped its risk evaluation within its head office, oriented toward risks in France, even though the company operates in more than a dozen other countries, primarily in the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Europe. Orange administered the exact same survey as a social audit questionnaire in those countries as it administers in France, despite evidence that, for example, Cameroon's military government shut down the internet more than any other African state. So this raises questions about telecom firms' complicity in government abuses, but this isn't featured in Orange's statement. The unique challenges to rights-respectful telecoms operation in Cameroon make no appearance in Orange's human rights due diligence. So investors asking questions like, what operation faces the highest risk for civil and political rights can evaluate whether the companies are considering contexts fulsomely or not. Another red flag is when interventions are driven by other business priorities, but phrased as human rights efforts. Walmart's approach is demonstrative here. Its salient issues are actually all legal requirements. They aren't established through any process of impact evaluation that was scoped to the full suite of human rights and just reflect the basic expectations of corporations under US law. Investors can always ask how companies identified their salient issues and should take note of whether rights holder interviews were conducted, human rights expertise was employed, and high-risk footprints and operations were identified. Another red flag is the use of statistics that obscure realities. So these are easy to spot as long as investors have taken a few minutes to Google harms and allegations alongside the company's name. Because when they present human rights issues as solved, but the issues are long-standing, you'll notice a disjoint. So Barrett Gold's 2020 Human Rights Report, for example, claimed to have all grievances, quote, resolved. But this was the same year its most controversial mine was shuttered amid fierce protests. To reconcile these statements, investors may need to dig deeper asking what complaints were fielded and requesting access to complaint logs. Another red flag, which is harder to spot, is when an operator presents tidy correlations between a salient issue and a footprint. On the one hand, it's critically important that salient issues reflect on the ground realities, but no high-risk operation has just one salient issue. Rio Tinto's approach demonstrates this problem. It laid out its human rights effort in a 2013 publication that hasn't been publicly updated, suggesting that case studies of salient issues addressed at each site represented comprehensive human rights management. Investors may be aware that in May of 2020, Rio Tinto blasted spiritually and archaeologically important rock shelters in the Yukon Gorge in Western Australia. Bearing this in mind, its 2013 references to Indigenous employment and dispute management and land use agreements were partial and disrespectful of Indigenous rights, while presenting a veneer of close consideration of issues. The fifth red flag is flashy numbers that aren't contextualized and claims that aren't directly about remedying harms. Nestle, for example, boasts that it has, quote, covered over 100,000 children in its cocoa farms. Looking closely, it's not clear whether any of these West African children have been removed from work or are actively pursuing education or are assisted in other ways, just clearly that they're enrolled in a monitoring system. But the US Department of Labor notes that there are over 1 million children in Cote d'Ivoire's cocoa groves, and data from the University of Chicago actually found that the prevalence of child labor in cocoa increased in the past decade. So with this context, the enrollment of children into a monitoring system is not indicative of harm reduction at all. And a figure like 100,000, which seems large, needs to be scoped in percentages and in terms of the scale of the problem. Finally, any suggestion that audits provide assurance of human rights protections or due diligence of implementation, these flag a lack of due diligence. And one of the clearest cases of this currently is in the solar supply chain, where evidence is now conclusive that solar panels cannot be sufficiently traced to assure that their polysilicon was produced outside of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, where a genocide is underway. The genocide has triggered sweeping US sanctions, and auditors actually get threatened and detained for trying to fulfill company audit requirements and are now fraudulently certifying operations rather than risk criminal sanctions by the CCP. And so indications that audits certify a supply chain or a commodity when audits are known to be ineffective is the last red flag. So what evidence can companies provide that they are doing real due diligence? And there are actually several signs of effective human rights due diligence, which taken together can demonstrate to investors that protecting rights holders is a priority. So first, companies should have a demonstrated process for screening their operations and supply chains for human rights risks and escalating their levels of investigations on high-risk operations. That escalation should include site-level investigation. Second, risk identification should be both contextual and operational. High-risk contexts heighten human rights risks, but so do specific operation types, and companies need to consider both. Third, companies should be able to demonstrate how the screening, risk assessment, and operational and contextual analysis was used to prioritize human rights issues and interventions. This is critical because the UNGPs are clear that companies should manage the most severe risks first, not the most affordable or the most press-worthy. Investors can ask to see the link between the assessment of severity and the rollout of interventions. And fourth, those interventions should demonstrably address the harms and risks identified. If the problem is environmental degradation and the remedy is financing for a nature reserve, investors should make sure that the nature reserve is located where the degradation is occurring and that the financing directly cleans up the identified pollution. Fifth, the interventions won't always work as planned, so investors should ask companies how they're monitoring their effectiveness and modifying them to achieve harm reduction. And finally, this process is only worthwhile if the harms are reduced. So if companies aren't tracking harm reduction, they are not respecting rights. This sounds like a lot of work, but it's actually not pie in the sky. There are companies that are doing this actively already. And this is drawn from Norsk Hydro's human rights due diligence process. And they've depicted it as an ongoing process for evaluating corporate impacts on human rights as they evolve over time. There are also snapshots that are necessary at particularly high-risk operations or contexts. And in the course of a company's enterprise-wide human rights due diligence, when high-risk footprints are identified, it's not enough to just acknowledge the risk. The companies must assess and manage those actual and potential impacts. So truly massive companies might need to make this assessment a two-part process, first conducting a targeted risk assessment of the operation to verify that the risks may actually be generating impacts, but generally it's enough for a company to have a high-risk footprint in order to trigger a human rights impact assessment, an HRIA. And Hydro did this, triggering HRIAs in Brazil and I believe Qatar. These HRIAs are part of the impact assessment family, the systematic and qualitative and quantitative investigation of situations on the ground, using multi-method techniques to gather inputs from directly and indirectly impacted rights holders. And the findings from these assessments are used to develop management plans carried out through project construction and implementation. And while the implementation of Hydro's model is undoubtedly perfect, investors should request access to these HRIAs and documentation of how interventions are being carried out to evaluate human rights performance. It will necessitate, though, that investors can evaluate the adequacy of the human rights impact assessment. So the flowchart on this following slide can guide investors through that evaluation. It is based on the Danish Institute for Human Rights key criteria for HRIA, and it's currently implemented by the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative for use in its assurance framework for auditors. So investors can ask first if there's a document or set of documents that the company refers to as a human rights impact assessment, or human rights assessment, or human rights risk assessments. If so, investors can ask, is it both participatory and non-discriminatory, meaning does it engage diverse, marginalized rights holders? And is it scoped both to include business relationships and all rights listed in the Universal Declaration? If so, there's a follow-up set of questions. Is it empowering, accountable, and transparent? So does it include feedback directly with affected rights holders? Does it rate impacts by severity? And does it prioritize interventions by that same severity? If so, then that's a confirmed HRIA. There are other scenarios where the organization may not have a named HRIA, but it has a chapter or a risk assessment that's more targeted. So if it includes a description of the methodology and it meets these 5 criteria in blue, then it may still qualify as an HRIA. If not, it's not an HRIA. There are some scenarios whereby part of the criteria outlined in the Danish Institute are met and part are not. This would be an incomplete HRIA. And investors could ask the company to produce follow-up documentation to demonstrate that participatory engagement in the mitigation of risks is completed. This has been just a brief overview of red flags in human rights due diligence, signs of effectiveness, and the differentiation between HRIA and HRDD. Please tune in to the Investor Alliance for Human Rights webinar series for more. Thank you so much.